Hello and welcome back to Connected, a podcast brought to you by Nova Economics Club, where we try to connect economic theory with present day topics. And with the European election around the corner, we are more than happy to welcome Duarte Costa. Sorry for my pronunciation. And yeah, I will just briefly introduce you. So, Duarte Costa was born in Lisbon in 1988, and he earned his bachelor's degree in geography from the University of Lisbon and his master's degree in climate change and policy from the University of Sussex. Um, since then, you earned a lot of, or you gained a lot of experience working with climate change, and you served as a consultant, researcher, and project manager for several institutions like the United Nations, Climate Scale, and Stantec, and also for several universities. And additionally, you are the co president of the political party Volt in Portugal, and you will be a candidate for the upcoming European elections that are scheduled for June. And first of all, we want to talk a little bit about Europe and then dig deeper into climate change. And yeah, let me start with the first question about the European integration. Um, so we wanted to know from you, in what specific political or economic dimensions do you think Europe could benefit more from more federalizations in your perspective?
Hi. Firstly, well done for this initiative. It's super important that we mobilize people to vote in the European elections, but also vote informed. And this type of initiative is what makes a difference in that. For us, we see this election as a very turning point in our lives. It's not just about deciding whether the EU will work a little bit better or will deliver a little bit more for people. It's about whether we will have a planet to live in the long term, whether we will have a free democracy where our core freedoms are respected, and also whether we have peace to endure in the continent. And the decisions that need to be made to have the three of them need to be done at European level and not at national level. Volt, you mentioned there the F word, the federal word, and Volt is the only outspoken party in Portugal about the need to move into a federation in the EU. Why do we stand for this? A federation is the most effective way to give power across a variety of regions, and in this case, a variety of independent nations. We don't want to erase the independent nations as people sometimes accuse us of. We want to give powers to the EU to be able to address issues that only there can be handled adequately. And these are essentially three. We need to defend Europe, so defense need to be something handled at European level. It also costs a lot less money. We also need to have foreign affairs at European level. We have a much more influent voice if we speak as a continent of 450 million people, rather than what we do now, which is sometimes is Ursula von der Leyen, sometimes is Emmanuel Macron, sometimes it's Scholz, and sometimes we even let the rest of the world know that we don't agree between ourselves and how we want to position ourselves externally. So this is the second one. And the third one, and this I think is very important for you guys here in this university, is finance. So we want to have the European finance minister because, as you will know, as students that study economics, we have an amazing project in the EU. We have a free market, but then we have a tax system that it's not European, it's national. So what happens is that large corporations, especially global corporations, they take advantage of the free market, but they also take advantage of the best fiscal national state in which they want to pay taxes, which means that they don't pay a fair share of taxes, which means that we all lose. So with the needs that we have of public European investment, we really need to get that fair share of taxes, and for that we need a federal finance minister.
Okay, thank you so much. Really interesting. You mentioned like really interesting points, and I also think like for example, defense is a really pressing issue, and with the war going on, we really feel the urge. And also for the foreign affairs, I mean, you mentioned it, it's really important. And coming back to finance, I think we want to dig deeper into that one because, as you said, we're students of economics. And yeah, because with the introduction of the euro, we've witnessed the federalization of monetary policy. However, there's no proper federalization of the fiscal policy. So you already mentioned the European finance minister. That could be like one possibility for federalization. And yeah, we just wanted to know um, I mean, you partly mentioned that question already. Do you think fiscal policy should follow a similar path as the monetary policy? And what level of coordination should there be in terms of fiscal policy? Maybe in addition to the common finance minister you already mentioned and common tax laws, are there anything, or is there anything else that you want to mention?
Yes, so we also want a European banking union and a fiscal union in the EU. These are two fundamental instruments for our economy to work in a much more competitive way globally. Um, and also in the idea of having a fiscal union and a finance ministry of Europe, of the EU, is also to tackle tax evasion that is essential to tackle to get the own funds of the EU for the needs it has. But also we want to change the logic of taxing in at the EU level, as in we're creating a new level. We don't want to tax positive things like profits and salaries. We want to tax negative things like unsustainable consumption and emissions. And we believe this is a process through which we add a new level of taxation that does not impact negatively the average person.
Mm.
It does two things. It goes and gets taxes that should have been taxed but in a global economy they are not, and it the most it can have in the individual's impact is behavioral economics, is sort of um, shifting the whole economy towards something much more sustainable, which is also economically much more advisable and in the long term much more and has a much better cost benefit.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really interesting, like this taxing of externalities, and I
Mm.
mean, in the face of climate change, I think it's a really important topic. So thank you for so much for mentioning it. Yeah, and now we want to switch a little bit to the enlargement of the European Union and its consequences, because as we already mentioned, foreign affairs, war going on in Ukraine. Um, we wanted to know what are or what will be the main challenges of an enlargement of the European Union to Ukraine, and yeah, what do you think this enlargement would have, which impacts do you think this enlargement would have for the other candidates?
The other candidate countries.
Yes.
So the enlargement of the EU is always a natural, organic process.
Mm.
It means the project is working well because others want to join, and so it has to happen. The other aspect is that the more we are, the more leverage and the bigger economy we will overall be, which is essential for the challenges we are facing now, such as losing competitiveness globally, but also having an issue of a pressing issue of having an autocratic regime like Putin's regime making a huge pressure on our union and our continent. So this is an inevitability, but when it comes to the reforms that we need to do, we believe that we need to do reforms in parallel within the EU and in the candidate countries. Our MEP Damen Bozelager, actually elected from Germany, he was one of the lead negotiators on the Ukraine facility. So the mechanism through which the EU is giving 50 billion euros to Ukraine to help in the reconstruction. We were able to introduce there two criteria that I think are very important that nobody was coming up with. And so it was a difference that we were able to make. One was that this money should mostly go should not just be centralized in the public administration, but should go to regions, municipalities, SMEs, and startups. And this is a reality thanks to that work. And also, there should be sustainability criteria to make sure that Ukraine builds back better, and we have that also there. Um, and in terms of reforms, I will talk about the reforms the EU should go in parallel with the ones that we need to push for the candidates to go as well. The ones we need to go is we have to understand that if we are more countries in the EU, we need to have a decision process that is able to represent the diversity but doesn't get blocked on that national diversity. So, one of the things we've been standing for in a long term is that the European Council should not have the decisions in the European Council should not be by unanimity. That's not even democratic when one country can block the will of all the other countries, but by a qualified majority. And we can find solutions to make sure that with the sizes of the countries, we don't fall into a trap in which some countries, because of the population, have a huge influence. We need to also move that European Council to something that we would like to a Senate, which is what we would like it to be, in a Senate that is elected uh, either by directly by people at European elections, or in the short term, we believe it's more effective to have it directly from national parliaments, because national parliaments represent the diversity, political diversity of each country. We also need to enforce the European instruments to defend the European interest or the union interest, especially the union financial interests. And these are two very important um, instruments we have, but they're not fully, their potential is not yet fully harnessed. I'm talking about the OLAF, the anti-fraud organism, and the EPPO, so the General Prosecutor of the EU. These are two instruments that would give, if in the way that we see them, they need to have the instruments to prevent and judge incidents of national corruption that undermines the union interests, financial interests, but also other interests.
Okay, thank you so much. Pretty
I
interesting.
hope this is not too technical and
No, no,
people can
no.
follow these ideas. But I really believe that in the European elections, we need to not just discuss the
Mm.
European Union, because in Portugal now everyone is very happy that the debates are about the EU.
Mhm.
We need to be more ambitious than that. That's what it should have been since the beginning. We also need to discuss which proposals each candidates are going to stand for.
Mm.
And in the Portuguese debate, this is not being done. We are discussing ideas and the intentions of different candidates, but we are not really discussing how exactly are going to pursue, for example, more ambition on climate change
Mm.
or on defense. How are we going to support Ukraine concretely? And as citizens and civil society, we need to ask that from these candidates and not just expect that they share values and ideas, because the European elections is way more than just having a vision of the world. It's about bringing in
Mm.
amendments to the decision processes that happen in the most important parliaments to solve these issues.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much for these ideas. I think it's really important, and as you mentioned, not only discussing the values, but also how we get there.
Exactly.
And
Yeah, if I was in the debates, I
yeah,
would be like, "How are you going to do this?"
yeah.
Because I see all the time, "Oh, we want to support more Ukraine."
Mm-hmm.
But the EU needs to reform. The EU needs to have its own mechanisms to have its own autonomous resources. How are you going to do that?
Mm.
Oh, we need to have a mutual debt. How are we going to implement that? Because that makes a huge difference, and this is exactly what they will be doing when they will be pushing for an agenda in the European Parliament. I'm saying them, but I'm also included in that process.
Okay, yeah, pretty interesting. I also think there are so many issues or so many topics, so many issues that are so pressing. So we really need to know how we're going to tackle them. And I want to come back to something you said about the support of the European Union for Ukraine. So you mentioned the 50 billion euros to support the reconstruction, and like maybe in more in general. In terms of resources, especially the funding, what do you think is the main consequence of the step of enlargement for the union in general, and maybe something special for the Portuguese economy?
Benefits of the enlargement
Mm-hmm.
for the EU.
Yes, like financially, what consequences does the enlargement have? Because I mean, you mentioned $50 billion for reconstruction in the Ukraine, and like given what's going on, like the destruction of mainly all of the infrastructure, there will be a much larger need to for financial or larger financial
Sure,
need for reconstruction. So,
sure.
what are the financial consequences for the European Union and maybe also for the Portuguese economy in special?
Okay. Well, the EU needs to increase its budget, and
Mm.
we want to we want that to happen. Actually, if we want the EU to be competitive with, for example, the US, we really need to ramp up the funds that the EU has as a whole, because we most of our public money is on the national level, but actually the costs of public investment and the effectiveness of those investments would be much higher if they would be done at EU level. I'm thinking about the climate transition, for
Mm.
example. If we want to have European high-speed railways, if it's done by the EU, it's much more effective than through a national network or national thinking. The same in terms of tackling inequality and poverty. The EU has very large pockets of extreme poverty. In Portugal, 40% of the Portuguese population is living around the level of extreme poverty. And how do we tackle this? The EU has the funds for this. We want to have a European basic income, which is different from the universal basic income. But the European basic income is a way in which people that work, and at the end of the month, the money that they earn from contributing to our economies is not enough to reach the minimum dignity level, as in pay their housing bills, food, medicine, education for their children. If this is not enough, there's something dramatically wrong with our economy, because everyone, whatever they are doing to contribute to the functioning of our economy, should have enough to have a dignant life, a minimum level of life. So we want that. We want the EU. It's a form of negative taxing. If people after if people with their income are not reaching a minimum level corrected by purchase power of dignified life, the EU can top up that difference, and that would correct immediately large inequalities, would bring up people into um, the economy, let's say, the market, and that would have large benefits. But coming back to the topic of Ukraine, um, we need to reform internally. We need to ramp up our funding to also be prepared to support Ukraine's reconstruction.
Mm.
And obviously, cohesion funds will be key, and there will be a shift from which countries receive cohesion funds, of course. And for us in Portugal, there will be a loss of cohesion funds, and we are aware of that. I think that there is no one saying that Ukraine shouldn't join because we're going to lose money. No one is saying that, which is very good on Portugal. It means that we truly have a spirit of solidarity. But obviously, we need to understand that the funds we have need to be well used to ramp up our economy, to scale up the competitiveness and the added value of our businesses. And this is the way to make sure that as net contributors that we
Mm.
will inevitably be of the European project, that we have a supporting economy in Portugal to pay for this.
Mm.
And this is something that I want to fight harder in the European Parliament. We need to make sure that European money is well used, and well used for me means, for example, European money reaches the small and medium enterprises in Portugal, the startups, and those that are making the economy, the Portuguese economy, for example, be more competitive in the future, the sectors of the future in the global economy. I had a meeting a few weeks ago with the president of the CCDR of the Centro region, Coimbra,
Mhm.
this big region that the Portuguese know. And she was telling me that for the first time, like the share of for example, the recovery funds, the PRR funds, the share that goes to the private sector has been increasing, which I see it as positive, but it's still it reached the highest ever, and it's 40 something percent. So my goal is to make sure that we get to a point that at least 50% of the money reaches the business sector, because it's the business sector that will deliver the growth of our companies and the competitiveness of their services and products to pay for our economy to then have its own mechanisms to generate the money we need to all these public investments that are necessary. And this is our last opportunity, I find, until 2030. Is probably our last biggest opportunity of EU funding. And if it's not well used, we will have a problem. It's not up to an MEP to decide how nationally funds are used, especially cohesion funds. This is up to the government.
Mm.
But there are a lot of instruments that we want to strengthen at European level that are not national. For example, the Horizon Europe, which is directly is the vanguard, the front line of innovation in Europe, and we want to triple that Horizon Europe, which I don't know if you're aware of this, but it has shrunk in the
Mm.
last months because the EU does not have the money to pay for all the things it is paying currently. So we want to triple it,
Mm.
and we want to also increase the Invest EU program. Is a specific program for SMEs, and we want to give it criteria that it positively discriminates parts of the EU that are suffering from brain drain. This is a huge problem in Portugal.
Mhm.
The youth of Portugal, and not just the youth, but the talent that is generated in places like this university is going elsewhere. It's great for that talent to have opportunities. It's great for the rest of the EU to benefit from the talent of Portugal. But the regions in Portugal that lose that talent are paying a very high price. And until the point that um, until we become a union of 27 prosperous economies
Mm.
united in one, we will not be relevant globally. We will not be competitive. The competitiveness of the EU comes from uh, um, an economy in which wherever you are in the union, there is prosperity, there is added value in the businesses that we have and the services that we provide, and not the current reality in which we have 15 countries that are prosperous, that are very competitive, and then 12 countries that are fighting
Mm.
to run after them. We
Mm.
should definitely become 27 prosperous economies united in one.
Okay, that's really interesting. Just one thing that came to my mind while you said all or while you shared all your ideas and plans. I think it's pretty interesting. Like also going back to the enlargement, to to give this vision of 27 and prosperous economies, because I think from where we're now, like as you said, the countries are really different in
Mhm.
terms of prosperity and ideas as well. But yeah, I think it's a great vision for the future and something really worth fighting for. But yeah, now we want to come to another topic, like as you already mentioned, and also it's for me it's a pretty interesting topic. We will now talk more about climate change and the green transition. And yeah, so we wanted to know what are the main economic and non-economic obstacles to the speed of responding to climate change and to a higher and more efficient cooperation at the European level.
Very good. Well, as I said before, this is a huge challenge.
Mm.
As I guess you are following that the Paris Agreement that we signed in 2015 had the goal that the global temperatures would reach 1.5 by 2100, and we are reaching it
Yeah.
now, as in the next years before the end of this decade, and depending on the projections. So we are going past all the estimates of the speed in which emissions could increase. It's true that the EU is sort of taking the foot out of the accelerator, as in decelerating the process of growing their emissions. So we were growing at 2% per year in the noughties, in the 2000s, and now we are growing at 0.5%. So that's positive news. But it also has a lot of aspects that are not fair, like exportation of emissions. So um, answering to your question, particularly into thinking of economic instruments, one of the instruments that the EU has, which is the biggest in the world and is being replicated elsewhere, is the EU ETS, the European
Mm.
Union Emission Trading Scheme. And this was a way, and there has been studies to demonstrate that we were able to lead to generate reductions led by the private sector and with private funding without a negative impact on the competitiveness of these companies and the prices that people pay for the services that they provide. So it really worked, but it was not that ambitious. We were able to
Mm.
reduce 30 something percent according to official EU data, which you always have to to look into the nitty gritty to make sure it's reliable. But let's use that number. We reduced 30 something percent. We need to reduce more. So one of the things I want to work with my colleagues in the European Parliament in this mandate is to make sure that EU ETS covers all sectors,
Mm.
and it has a very ambitious target by 2030. So we want to reduce 80% of emissions by 2030, and we use the market to do this. So instead of having a very soft process of reducing with this instrument, we sort of want to push the lever of intensity of this market.
Mm.
How do we do this? We just reduce the number of licenses available to emit, and that makes the cost of them very high, which means that you will have to spend as much money as possible to reduce your emissions. I hope that if there's business people listening to me, they don't think that I'm crazy. The thing is, if we don't do this, the costs of the externalities of climate change in our economy are much bigger. And yesterday in a debate, someone was calculating, I didn't check the numbers, but someone was saying that it's about 7 billion euros a day in the EU. So what we want to do is to use an instrument that we already have, that the world has actually been replicating, to accelerate this reduction. We want 80% by 2030. We want net zero by 2035 in the energy sector, which is the one that is best prepared to do this, because the energy sector in Europe has started this process in the 2000s, and particularly in the 2000, in the last decade. I'm thinking how to say this in English. Um, the the reductions were quite substantial, and we see the result. We have a big we already have a lot of renewables. We need to have more, and we need to have a European energy grid, because some countries have a
Mm.
huge renewable potential. We also need to reduce our needs for energy, so we need more efficiency, but we also need to have the courage to say certain things that do not have an added value and cost a lot of energy and emissions, we should just discontinue and shift these activities to other activities that we don't have a lack of things to do currently. So we need to shift and to have this courage, which I haven't seen in our generation of
Mm.
politicians.
Okay, really interesting. Thanks so much also for mentioning the ETS, I think, and the really ambitious target of 80% reduction. And maybe it's also worth mentioning that the carbon border adjustment mechanism
Mhm.
is around the corner, and
Yeah,
maybe it also like tackles the issue of competitiveness, because I think,
yeah,
like as you said, maybe business people or in general people may think, okay, if we have to pay a lot of if we have to pay a lot for the emission reduction, like
yeah.
isn't that impacting our competitiveness? So yeah, I
And
think that's
on that, I've been meeting with different business clusters,
mm,
and they're the leaders of different clusters, for example, in Aveiro and Minho in Portugal. And I have to say that the most pro-Europe people in this country are the business people,
mm,
because they know very much the benefits that come from there, and also the needs for regulation that has to come from the European level. And one of the things that they liked, we have in our program an idea that we want to bring sustainability and also human rights criteria to
mm,
our commercial border. So if companies want to sell into this huge market of 450 million people, most with great purchase power, not all. We want all of them to have great
mm,
purchase power. We need to have to make sure that these companies that are selling into our union, that they follow our values. So this measure has a twofold advantage immediately, which is protecting European businesses to be more competitive, at least in the domestic market. They have they have no unfair, external rivals,
Mm.
but also it's a way to push for the industries around the world to reduce their emissions and to be to have at least a matching level of ambition when it comes to the climate transition. And we need them to reduce emissions because that's how we protect ourselves as well.
Mm. Okay, really interesting. Thanks so much. And now we want to like dig a little bit deeper into also the experience you already made as a consultant and business developer and project manager. So, what do you think are the best measures the European institutions can apply to stimulate and contribute to the combat against the climate change? Maybe next to the enlargement of the ETS.
Okay. So yeah, we already touched the commercial border and the
Mm.
EU ETS. We also need to, I touched there and I will maybe go a bit deeper on that. We need to reduce the energy we use
Mm.
for our quality of life. One of the things we want to do is to push for a European high-speed railway network. Um, we want all European capitals to be connected by railway. This is a way, for example, to reduce the dependence on planes. We also want to reduce the dependence on cars. And this has a major effect in our economy from our individual purses. I don't have a car, but for those people that have a car, if they don't need one, if they don't, even if they have one, but they don't need to use it on a regular basis, this is a huge benefit for each and everyone's pockets of those that have a car, but also for our economy as a whole, because we are sending money away, usually to totalitarian regimes, to get fossil fuels to move around. So we have an agenda as well for public transportation and bike use. Portugal has uh, goals, and Portugal has a national strategy to promote the use of bikes, and it has commitments of funding for this. And the government has failed at all completely on the goals. Just to make you aware, the goal was 5% by next year, 2025, and 10% by 2030. This is percentage of people that use bikes to move for their needs of going around, moving, and we are at 1%, and we have been spending even sometimes less than €1 million in these agendas. So um, we need to change this, and one way to change this is to make sure that the EU has the instruments to penalize countries that don't do as they promise they will. And because the biggest impact of the failure of these member states is their people, is the Europeans that live under their government. Because in Portugal, for example, why are we less likely to use a bike to go around? Why is our government not giving us the right infrastructure so that we
Mm.
can safely ride a bike and with that contribute to tackle climate change, but also save a lot of money? I when I was in Aveiro, I was visiting the bike cluster. I don't know if you know, but
Mm.
Portugal is the number one manufacturer of bikes in
Mm.
Europe. So this growth of bike use across the EU, in France and Germany, in the Netherlands, it was a big bonus for our economy because
Mm.
we increased massively our exports of bikes. Yet the people that manufacture the bikes in the district of in the street of Aveiro, they cannot ride a bike to their job, to their work.
Mm.
Why? Because it's super dangerous. It's like this big national road, no cycle paths, and they say, I would love to come by bike. I would love my kids to go to school by bike because then
Mm.
I don't need to drive them and pick them up. But it's I understand them that having a child going on a bike on a major road with big trucks, etc., it's not safe. So,
Mm.
and building bike track cycling lanes is not that expensive.
Mm.
It's just political will.
Yeah, it's true. And cycling in Lisbon would also save you the gym membership because it's so hilly.
Yeah, yeah.
So Yeah.
Well, that's arguable. You know, cyclists, they don't like when people say that because the percentage of hilly streets is not that high in Portugal, but some are very steep.
It's true. And yeah, I think like you mentioned a really important points. And now like maybe to close, one last question. Um, how do you think that the European Parliament should look at the digital economy and technological innovation and urban mobility? We already touched that a little bit, and should articulate them with sustainable development. So for the urban mobility, we said okay. Increase the number of cycling lanes and make it in general more attractive to use the bike in comparison to the car, connecting European capitals by with the high-speed trains. What other steps could the European Parliament implement?
So I think for mobility, I've said so public transport,
Mm,
bikes, and high-speed trains to prevent the use of cars and planes. I'm surprised, positively surprised with the question on the digital economy because I have not heard any answers on that.
mm,
Nobody has asked that, but I think this is a major topic. The digital economy is a big slice of the global economy currently and will be more and more will grow more and more in the next years. We need the EU to make sure that our businesses and the ones that are already competitively working in this space that they have the support from public money because this is what's happening in the US and in other
mm,
regions to advance and to take the risks to get to the next level. But we also need, as we like in Europe, we need the regulation to make sure that the digital space is safe and both for citizens but also for businesses in terms of competitiveness for employees in terms of automation of processes and so whenever we think about how to make regulation to protect our interests, it's not at national level; it's at European level. I wanted I wanted as well to add another topic that I didn't ask, but I think it's fundamental and actually emotionally is triggering me a lot, which is the one of democracy.
mm,
I find that I came into politics because as a climate change expert, I felt that our politicians did not have the right courage and even creativity to tackle the climate crisis. But currently, I'm feeling very much divided between what's more important: saving the climate, saving the planet, and protecting our climate, let's say, or ensuring that we have a freedom and a democracy that works. In Portugal, I'm very disappointed because on the one hand um, we don't have the space for a true debate of ideas with proposals
mm,
like we said before. We have blunt, we have flagrantly the media, the press, the televisions particularly, they are violating the rules, the law when it comes to treating all candidacies with parity, with equality. We have made there's multiple parties with legal cases against the televisions. We are one of them. We just heard yesterday that in one of the complaints against one of the radios in Portugal, that they gave us a reason that indeed there is an interpretation of freedom by the press that is in violation with equality of candidacies. And all these problems, we also have emerging fascist parties. We have far right parties. For example, yesterday we had a TV debate with a far right candidate. He said that Ukraine should join Russia to make sure that there is peace. He said that he's an environmentalist because conservative people like to conserve nature. He said that living in some parts of Lisbon is worse than in the refugee camps outside of Europe. And the journalists and the other candidates were just reacting to this with all normality. When we normalize this kind of discourses, when we don't have freedom, real freedom of running to elections because the press has made the choice of those that actually are valid, and when we live in a country or in a Europe where young people, particularly, but the population is being radicalized towards an
mm,
understanding of the world that is dangerous. And you are from Germany. I am also very concerned with what's going. on there, and with the
Yeah.
judicial cases also against AfD and other threats. We need to do something about this. And I
Mm.
don't see the Democrats. This is my point. Sorry, it was a bit long, but my point is that I don't see the Democrats really going after their democracy. As
Mm.
in, we cannot accept that the press violates the rules when it comes to give a fair coverage of who is running for an election. We cannot accept that the youth and the children are being radicalized. We had massive conflict between 9-year-old children based on racism and hatred.
Mm.
How do we stop this? We need to stop this with stricter rules and enforcement of those rules when it comes to protecting democracy and equality of candidacies. We also stand for moving the treaties that run the EU. So the treaties in which countries signed to join the EU, like Hungary, but also the rest of the EU. We want to make these treaties a constitution. It's
Mm.
not writing a new
Mm.
constitution, it's to use the commitments that the countries did, and then with that constitution have a constitutional court that has the judicial power to enforce what countries said that they would do
Mm.
and they are not. And we need to protect human rights, and for that we need a European Human Rights Court that has the power to enforce the fulfillment of human rights across the union, regardless of people's opinions or who is in government. Because if we don't look after now of
Mm.
these aspects of our democracy and across the 27 countries, we are going to start, I think we're going to start to crumble, and we can even be um, get to this very dangerous point of through democracy, we elect a new type of way of doing politics that is not democratic.
Mm.
We cannot let that happen.
Okay, thank you so much. I think those were really important closing words. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us, for sharing your ideas, and all the best for the upcoming election.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
again, congratulations for this initiative.